I mean, what was it like to have cops chasing maybe you, I don't know, some people down the street and with clubs and be beaten in that fashion? Can you give me a sense of it?
Well, I think that it changed. I think on the first nights when the police came through the park and beat people, including the news media, there was a sense of surprise, and that people had not really come to grips with the fact that at that point that Nixon was running on a law and order campaign, and in some ways Johnson was trying to outlaw and order the Republicans, and that Daley certainly had taken very strong positions, around the death of Martin Luther King and the rioting that followed. And so that even though all that had happened, even though that the stage was set for a major confrontation, and that there were 13,000 police and some 15,000 National Guards people and so on and so forth, even though that the ambience, the climate was such that it was almost inevitable for there to be violence and to be a social breakdown, I still think that the first night when basically kids, anti-war demonstrators, sat in the park and then were beaten up, and I think that there was people were surprised. People didn't believe it would happen. By the second and third nights, and fourth nights, that changed, I think, and you had a greater sense of outrage, and so people got really angry, and that's when there were more rocks thrown by demonstrators, and that's when people actually resisted to some extent, although resisting the Chicago police wasn't exactly a fair fight. But people then, I think, the anger, and that by the time we got to the last days in front of the Hilton Hotel, and in the band shell that day, when the violence erupted, I think by those days people were absolutely bent and determined that they were going to try and march, or they were going to move out to in front of the Hilton, and I think that they wanted to make a statement. So you kind of went from a state of surprise and fear, because the Chicago police really did come in very violently, to a state of outrage and finally to kind of a determination to really make a statement to the country about what was happening in Chicago. So I think it changed, and I think it reflected, in a sense, the realization that this was like a confrontation that almost had to happen by 1968 because of the development of the anti-war movement and all the other activities of the 60s, that what was happening was almost predictable that such a confrontation would occur at some point.
Well, were you assaulted, basically? I mean, were you...
Well, I don't know if you've seen films or things, but on the day where the major violence occurred in front of the Hilton Hotel, earlier that day there was a gathering at the band shell of speakers and rallies, and then we were going to march to the convention center, and of course that was blocked, and people filtered over to the Hilton Hotel. But at the band shell, the police lined up facing demonstrators who were listening to speeches and things, and Rennie Davis and I stood facing a line of marshals who were sort of crowd control people. And then when the police charged, both Rennie and I were hit in the head and hit in the stomach and up elsewhere. And so Rennie was badly bloodied. I was just sort of knocked, kind of awake, but sort of knocked out, because 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes later, when we were trying to figure out what to do,
were you unconscious?
No, but I was clearly in another place. I was dizzy and disoriented, and so it took me another half hour to kind of straighten out. But I don't think it was anything particularly serious, but it was surprising, because the crowd was quiet and listening to the speeches, and the police made an overt attack on the crowd, and of course Rennie and I were in between the two, and we got the brunt of it in some ways, but other people were badly injured. And so, I mean,
what did the club, I mean, I've seen the footage a million times, but what did it feel like to have a club hit your head?
Hard to say. I played a lot of football in high school and college, and I would say it was similar to having a concussion, you know, when you, under those circumstances. And so, I don't want to make too much out of it, sure. A lot of people were badly injured, a lot of press were badly injured on the first nights, and so I was momentarily knocked out, but Rennie, on the other hand, was badly bloodied and was actually, I assume, taken to the hospital. I don't remember at this point. But I think that later that night, when people were in the streets and then the real rioting occurred, then I think that was a confrontation. And the police were clearly bound and determined to clear the streets, and it was but I thought what was more frightening in some respects was not the overt violence, but it was when you're trying to cross over the bridge and the National Guard has machine guns set up, and you know that at some level a much greater level of violence could occur, a much more greater level of violence. And of course, a couple years later, when they had the shootings at Kent State, you realize that sometimes the distance between major violence and protest are not necessarily so great, and people were obviously killed then. And at People's Park in Berkeley, people were killed. So that the thing that was scary, I remember that there was trying to get over to the Hilton Hotel, crossing the bridge from the bandshell over to the Hilton, and it was a veritable military force, and that was frightening because you realize that depending upon somebody's trigger finger or somebody's some demonstrator's response, you could have a much more serious situation. So I think that the worst thing about Chicago was, in a sense, the military environment that was established, and that was pervasive. I mean, you have all these helicopters going overhead, you have National Guard set up, and so it wasn't just an individual cop beating a demonstrator. It really had to do also with absolutely pervasive sense of what could happen potential. Yeah,
I see that Tiananmen, basically.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's the danger, because all it takes is something to go awry and you find yourself in a much more serious situation. Of course, Kent State was exactly the example of that.
That's